get an answer that's right. I'd like to start by asking the panelists to introduce themselves. Scott, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you guys are doing?
Sure. Scott Metzner, been developing in New York City, primarily affordable housing for the first 20 years or so of my 30-plus year career, and currently, last 10 years, we really haven't been developing any, requiring any multifamily, but shifted over to primarily developing, acquiring, assembling, developing a mixed-use commercial site in West Harlem. And Shimon alluded to the Tasty Lab building, which, along with JP Morgan Asset Management, we're developing as a 350,000 square foot purpose-built life science building as part of this 1.1 million square foot development that we're working on.
Hi, my name is Michael Givner. I work for Morgan Stanley's Real Assets Group. We are a real estate investor across the risk spectrum, and I focus on opportunities in the Northeast.
Good morning, I'm David Schwartz, principal and co-founder of Slate Property Group. We're multifamily owner, developer, builders, so we do everything from low-income housing, market rate. We buy and renovate existing buildings. We do a little bit of condo. So we've been, across the spectrum. More recently, we've been very focused on affordable housing. So that's been a big growth area for us. So we're doing quite a bit of that. And Shimon talked a little bit. We've been involved in a lot of rezonings that we're going to continue to be involved in as the rest of this year and the next couple of years.
Good morning, I'm Seth Pinsky. I'm with RXR Realty. We own, manage, operate about 25 million square feet of commercial real estate in the New York region with a heavy focus on Class A office space in Manhattan. We also have about 6,000 units of multifamily in various stages of development around the region. My focus is, as over the last several years, been on what we refer to as our emerging submarket strategy, looking for areas around the region where there's been historic underinvestment and partnering with municipalities to try to bring private capital to the table and hopefully not only make nice returns for our investors, but also create economic activity in these areas. Over the last couple of years, that's kind of evolved into a broader public-private partnership practice. We're now active building a couple of terminals at JFK with JetBlue, and we're also working on a project that we'll talk about later, consistent with the East Midtown rezoning block from here at the Grand Hyatt Hotel. We're going to be tearing that down, making very significant improvements to the subways below, and then building a large office building and new Hyatt Hotel at the top.
I'm Mayor Mintz, tax partner at Burden LLP. I've been there for over almost 25 years at this point. And I head up the real estate department with a couple other of my partners. We've been a large accounting firm with 15th largest accounting firm in the city. We do a lot of real estate work on the transactional side. We also do the standard tax and audit stuff, but we do have a lot of attorneys, LLMs, myself included, that get involved in a lot of these transactions. And I'm excited to have the panel here today. Thank you guys very much for coming. I guess we'll start with Scott. I know you said you do the life science building. What caused you to look at life science in New York? I mean, that's really something that's unusual.
So it's a little bit of a long story, and we sort of evolved over time. And part of it was we evolved away from multifamily. Part of it was my frustration with working with city agencies and watching the increasing regulatory environment. And as we moved into commercial development in West Harlem and started with one building and ultimately ended up assembling multi-block, multi-acre, multi-building project that we ultimately sort of master planned. We watched Columbia's campus expand in Manhattanville, and one of the first buildings, or the first building they built, was the Jerome Green Building, which is probably $1 billion state-of-the-art Renzo Piano designed lab building that Columbia is housing literally its Nobel Prize winning professors in. And City College is just to the north of us, and the New York Structural Biology Center is there, and all of Columbia's medical campus is not far from us to the north. And so we started getting a good deal of interest from the life science community in what we were building. And we sort of naively were waving people in. And at the same time, the mayor's life science initiative was being formed. And make a long story short, ultimately we decided there was enough interest to sort of redesign, re-engineer the Tasty building away from what we basically were ready to build, and develop it on spec as a life science building. We think that there is a need in the city. We think it's going to be a small but important growing economic driver in the city. And as a straight real estate play, we think that we're hitting a rare place in the market where there seems to be excess demand versus supply. And we think that our timing, we're a small and nimble enough development company that we sort of slid into an ideal timing situation where these buildings are complicated. Any building in New York is complicated. Developing a life science building is very complicated. And so we think we have a couple of years at least lead time on our competition.
And I think, Seth, you guys also are involved, whether it's ours or before, a lot of these colleges coming to New York and developing that stuff.
Yeah, I think one of the things when I was with the Bloomberg administration that we observed was that when you looked around the world at the most successful economies in the 21st century, what you saw was that they had at their core a critical mass of research and development and talent creation in the applied sciences fields. And so we were very actively partnered with Columbia as well as with the state in helping Manhattanville to advance. Tasty Building is actually an EWC property. And it's great to hear what it's being used for. And then we're also actively involved in the creation of the new campus on Roosevelt Island that Cornell and the Technion have built, and that's open and operating. And I think that as we look at the success of New York's economy, and there are lots of challenges, all of which I'm sure we'll be talking about with this panel, but there's also a lot of success, and I think one of the big reasons for that success is our ability to not just generate talent, but also attract talent from all over the world. And in this 21st century ideas-based economy, the most important competitive advantage that any city or region can have is talent. And what's fascinating to see is the emergence of New York now as a center of high technology. And I think that one of the big reasons for that is that some of the more traditional centers, like Boston and San Francisco, are literally tapped out. The companies that are based in these areas just can't find talent anymore, and so they're coming to New York with this enormous reservoir of talent and these great institutions that we have. And I think that that's something that will power our economy for many, many years to come.
To add here, one of the striking dynamics in our mind, and we've been focused on the life science space across the country, have yet to find an opportunity in New York. But when you look at graduates, life science graduates across the country, New York is on par with Boston and the Bay Area. And then when you look at NIH funding, New York is a close third to those two other markets. And so I do think when you look at an office sector in the city north of 400 million feet and see less than 2 million feet of life science space, I do think there is significant runway here.
One of the things we were talking about is affordable housing. Maybe you can also talk for a minute about the different, I know affordable is like a generic term, whether it's low-income tax credit. Maybe you want to talk about for a minute also, Michael, about some of these affordable stuff that you guys are working on.
We are focused on, affordable both capital A and lowercase a across the country. In New York specifically, I think the new overlay makes it more challenging, but are excited to see opportunities, coming out of this new reform. I think David may have a better perspective there.
Yeah, we're doing, so affordable housing is a term that's, can kind of mean anything. We view it as anything that is regulated in some way, so anything that's not totally market driven. So it's everything from from housing for homeless, which we're involved in, all the way up to sort of low-income housing, middle-income housing, and even, one of the interesting things that we're seeing now is that affordable housing is now needed for people that never thought that they would need affordable housing. So under the new Affordable New York, we're doing lotteries for people making 130% of AMI, which for those of us who don't do that is about $100,000 a year. And what we're finding is people don't even know that they should be applying for affordable housing at that level because they don't view themselves as people that need affordable housing. And if you went back 20 years ago or 15 years ago, you could find affordable housing in places like Long Island City, Bed-Stuy, and Harlem that was just naturally occurring. And that's not around anymore. So there's a need for government to help create that housing. So it's something that we're really focused on.
And if I could just jump in on that, what's been a little bit frustrating, I think, in the discussion about affordable housing over the last, especially 6 months, where it's been a big topic in the world of politics, focusing in particular on rent regulation, is that there's been very little focus on what the real underlying cause of our affordability crisis is. And we have a crisis in the city of affordability, and it's something that we do need to address. But the underlying cause of the crisis here is not that we don't have enough rent-regulated units. We have 1 million rent-regulated units in New York City, and those units are going to be even more tightly regulated. The problem that we have is that we're just not creating enough housing, period. And it's fundamentally a supply and demand imbalance that's driving this affordability crisis. And in fact, a lot of what the legislators are doing up in Albany and here in the city is actually making it harder to produce more housing, which is only going to make the crisis worse, even with all the changes in rent regulation. But one of the things that we've been looking at to try to address this, and where we think there's actually a significant opportunity, is in affordable housing that isn't with a capital A and capital H, but a lowercase a and a lowercase h. And the area that we've been focusing on is in the suburbs of the city, where you have huge areas of undeveloped land, often surface parking lots that surround transit nodes, many of which are as accessible, if not more accessible, to New York City than parts of the city. I mean, we're, for example, developing in Yonkers and New Rochelle, where it's a 30 to 35-minute Metro North train ride into Manhattan. I live in Park Slope. It's a 40-minute commute when the subway's working, and it's a lot more pleasant on Metro North. But the challenge has been historically that in these areas there's been community opposition to development and density, but now because of a number of issues that the suburbs are facing, there's more of a receptivity. And just to give you a sense of the scale of the opportunity there, the RPA, the Regional Plan Association, did a study, and they found that if you just were to develop at moderate density around all of the transit nodes in the New York region, you could create about 250,000 new housing units, which not only would help with the supply and demand imbalance, but also because of rents in these areas, even the market rate units in these communities would be considered at the high end of affordable here in New York City. And you create a huge reservoir of housing for the workforce, which is critical to the future of the city.
I think just to add to what Seth said, affordable housing, I think it's so often looked at that it's just a New York City thing, but the truth is it's a regional thing. I mean, we have a company, we have, I think, 130 employees. People live, in a radius that they can get to our office. So we have people in Long Island, we have people in Queens, Manhattan, Brooklyn, New Jersey, Westchester, Connecticut, even Pennsylvania. And the only way to solve this problem is to look at it regionally. New York City can't alone build all the housing and make it affordable for all the people that need it. It just won't work.
But so what interests me in Bill's discussion, I think Seth said, policies had nothing to do with what's going on in Albany or New York right now, is that our industry has done such a poor job of promoting real estate and multifamily affordable with a capital or small case A housing development in New York. What a driver our industry is in New York, how philanthropic we are. I mean, it's interesting to take a morning like today and highlight Legal Outreach, which is an amazing group. When you think about industries in New York and what individuals involved and companies do for this city, but the demonizing that's gone on and the lack of policy discussion or true attempt to look at this complex issue. I was shocked I was shocked when I go to dinner with friends, and they have no conception of what we all take for granted. I opened up New York Magazine this week for anybody who saw it. On the back page, the matrix of what's going on in the city this week, and at the despicable side, I see greedy landlords suing to unwind rent laws. And I think about my kids picking up that magazine, and I think as an industry, we need to do a better job getting our ideas out there, because the affordable housing crisis is not going to be fixed by the people who brought us NYCHA or subway or jails or public education. It's going to be solved by our industry.
100% right.
And I guess now that we're talking about the suburbs and developments there, what are you guys finding like in terms of developing the suburbs versus New York? Is it easier? Is it harder? Is it cheaper? Is it more expensive?
Well, what's interesting about the suburbs is that there is no suburbs. It's a series of communities and overlapping jurisdictions. I have to admit that having worked in New York City my entire career, I knew very little about how the suburbs work, and shocked to see the levels of government, villages that are part of towns, water districts that don't match municipal borders, you have fire districts that don't match the water districts, school districts which are independent of the cities. But in any event, it's complicated. Historically, the people who moved to New York suburbs tended to move there to get away from the city. And so anything that even smelled of density or urbanism was immediately opposed by suburban voters. But what's been happening over the last several years is that the suburbs in New York have had a very hard time maintaining the two demographic populations. One is young professionals and the other is aging empty nesters, both of whom have been moving into central urban areas. And as a result of that, they've had a hard time attracting the businesses that are looking for that workforce. And so what you've had occur as a result of that is that the tax bases in the suburbs have been flat or declining while their expenses continue to rise. And so today, 10 of the 10 counties with the highest property tax burden in the country are in the suburbs of New York City. And what these communities are realizing is that in some cases, in order for them to reverse this trend, they need to start attracting that workforce back, which means creating the kinds of communities that these people are looking for. And the opportunity for them is in their historic downtown. So we've partnered, for example, with New Rochelle, which I mentioned before, and we worked with them on entitling over 11 million square feet of development in their downtown. And as master developer, we're responsible for 3 to 4 million square feet of that. We just opened our first 28-story multifamily building there. We have another 2 that are coming behind that, and a third project not far behind that. Yonkers, we've been very active and have found a very collaborative government. Stamford, same thing. Glen Cove on Long Island, we're working on a development at the hub around Nassau Coliseum in Nassau County. So I think the answer to your question is that it's not easy, but that there's the beginning of an alignment in some communities, and if you choose your communities wisely and you approach them, I guess, in a respectful way, which hopefully one would do with any community, there is the opportunity to do some really big things.
I noticed it because I live in Long Island also. I'm starting to notice a lot of these communities are getting away from the model where the housing is here, the mall is here, the restaurants are here. I know in some of your developments you're kind of creating like a master plan community. Are you doing anything different in terms of like the mix of the buildings in the communities?
Yeah, I mean, the goal in all of these areas is to create downtowns or to build on existing downtowns. And so that means active, walkable communities with vibrant street life, retail, restaurants, etc. Looking at the street level activity as an amenity for the multifamily above. We're looking to work with cultural institutions to bring them into these communities. We're working on job training programs to make sure that the people who live in these communities also benefit from the development. And then the long-term hope, and I think if you look at how economic development works, it's probably a longer-term hope, is that if you get a critical mass of residents and you build that vibrant, diverse street life, then eventually you can attract businesses and get commercial activity, which is where you really start to get the virtuous cycle that the outer boroughs have seen.
One thing we've really been struck by in the burbs is just the top line rents that have been achieved. These are rent levels which people thought, were beyond unachievable earlier this cycle, and just shows you that a transit-oriented, appropriately conceived project can be tremendously successful.
And I think one of the things that I've heard people talk about is the Uber is actually helping a lot of these suburban developments because you don't need a car anymore. Everything's walkable, everything's a $10 Uber to get from place A to place B. So that's pretty, interesting too. What about infrastructure deals? I know there's a lot of talk about New York needing more infrastructure to support these deals. Are you guys seeing any public-private stuff or any type of infrastructure stuff that's being floated out there?
We're actually seeing a lot of opportunity. I think for a variety of historical reasons, the United States has lagged the rest of the world in public-private partnerships, primarily because we have a very efficient municipal financing market, which has made it very cheap for governments historically to build on their own and to raise capital, and also because there have frankly been some bad examples of public-private partnerships that are continuously pointed to as the reason why you want to avoid them. But here in New York, I think because of the scale of the need that we have, our governments at city and state level are increasingly looking at partnerships with the private sector, and I think they're being smart about it, structuring these public-private partnerships not as revenue grabs where they're just privatizing assets and trying to pull future revenues forward, but looking to create new assets. And so, as I mentioned, we're partnered with JetBlue and a group called Vantage out of Vancouver, working on 2 new terminals at JFK, which are part of a $13 billion master development at JFK that the Port Authority is sponsoring. And then we're also partnered with mission-driven organizations, which isn't quite public-private partnerships, but universities, for example, working with them on trying to unlock some of the real estate value that they have. We have a project in downtown Brooklyn working with Long Island University. We're just about to break ground on a 34-story apartment building, and we'll be building new academic facilities at the bottom of that for the university. But what I would say is that in some ways, these public-private partnerships and working with municipalities are one of the places where you can actually find opportunity today in a fairly high-priced environment where it's hard to buy land and buy properties that at levels that at least we think make sense. Because of the hair that's on some of these developments, a lot of competition stays away from them. But it's challenging. Government is never easy to work with, and I would say that today, government in New York is probably harder than it's been in a while to work with. Not because there's a lack of good intent on the part of government officials, but it's just the layers of bureaucracy and the layers of rules and regulations that you have to comply with. There's a lot of time and a lot of effort that goes into these projects.
And I know one other asset class that we're hearing a lot of recently with all the Amazon and all the other delivery stuff on the internet is this last mile kind of concept. Do you see any deals on this where people are building warehouses specifically to ship to the New York area? I know that Amazon is not here anymore. Are you guys seeing any of that kind of deal?
Yeah, we're certainly seeing significant interest across the city for last mile space. It's challenging because you've seen a lot of this stock get converted to alternate uses in truly the infill last mile locations, and you've seen tremendous rent pressure as a result thereof. So when you are seeing north of 10% annual rent growth, it's a space that's attracting significant capital and interest. I think one of the dynamics at play when you look at absorption for true last mile stock, approximately 50% has been e-commerce related. And I think that trend, if you look, going back to 2000, I think e-commerce has grown at, a 15% annual clip. And so I think that phenomenon is only going to continue here. And it'll be interesting. We're starting to see people think about and pursue double-decker industrial projects. The verdict is still out there, but we're seeing people underwrite significant rents.
So one thing in addition to the last mile we're seeing is that a lot of companies that require vehicles in Manhattan to do business, there's no parking available. So at the same time, zoning, including in our project, has changed, so the parking, even any parking is not required. You have companies that service Manhattan that require parking that we can't figure out how to attract them because we can't make the numbers work for parking. Especially in our case where there's a height limit. So if you build parking, you're taking away from the actual rent producing asset.
And one thing that we're seeing related to the industrial is that it's causing a problem on the multifamily developers because we used to be able to buy the industrial space and multifamily was always the highest and best use, and now it no longer is. So it's sort of, as we gobbled up a lot of industrial space, industrial numbers have gone up. So even if I looked at a property recently where somebody said you could do a rezoning, I said, even if you're successful in the rezoning, which this was a tough neighborhood to do it, it's still worth less than the industrial. So it's, kind of, an office and things like that have moved to the boroughs. So it's kind of interesting how, as those rents went up, it's made it harder to buy multifamily.
Yeah, I mean, we hear a lot of talk about that in Long Island also, where there's just such a push between different asset classes because a lot of the buildings are changing, and at a certain point they're changing from industrial to residential, and then half the people want to change the residential back to industrial. Long Island's always been like an industrial area with Grumman and the Lowe's.
Right.
Yeah, you've certainly seen industrial rents on Long Island spike dramatically as people have been forced out of Long Island City or Maspeth or other more infill locations. And so whereas Long Island industrial rents used to be, well south of $10 a foot, they're in certain instances are exceeding that level.
Yeah. And some of them are actually getting creative and turning them into like rock walls and trampoline parks and these formerly factory type places, and now some of those may actually get priced down. I guess one of the other things we should talk about is now that the rents are kind of a little harder on the residential side, are you guys finding more competition for a lot of these kinds of non-residential deals, or is it people just sticking to what they know?
I mean, we're certainly seeing a lot of people are looking. I think a lot of people are looking outside New York. Multifamily developers, I think, are all exploring outside New York. We're seeing a lot of interest in sort of the hotel and some of the other, there are a lot of concepts that are, hotel kind of concepts that are a little bit different, where you're sort of having, some companies are doing apartments for hotels or hotels with co-working space in them and a lot of new concepts. So I think there's a lot, I think a lot of the people in the multifamily space are really looking at what do they do next, because the whole business of buying existing buildings and renovating them is largely gone in New York. So I think it's either geographic changes or product changes.
We find it hard to buy anything in New York for our model. And the prices are still very high. There's a lot of money available. I think even some of these buzzwords like opportunity zones are giving people false comfort that that's some sort of panacea. I think prices are very high.
In terms of just looking forward, I know there's a lot of excitement in certain areas, not as much excitement in others. Shimon just went through the numbers. It's kind of hard in situations like this to figure this stuff out, but what are you guys thinking like in the next 2 to 5 years? Like, what do you think the obstacles are going to be, or what do you think the bright spots are going to be?
I don't know if we have enough time for the obstacles. For us, we're very focused on affordable housing. I think it's just the market. And across the whole spectrum, right? So we sort of, we're doing the lowest of the low incomes, but we also want to do middle income. So we think that's a really big spot. I think it's a big challenge for New York. I think, a couple of my panelists were talking about that companies want to come here for the talent. I think traditionally we've only looked at affordable housing for people that live here. We've done not as good a job at affordable housing for those that are coming here. So sort of looking at the students that are going to all the universities and spending all this money building, with Cornell and Technion and all these things. And then if we lose all that talent, I think that's been a big thing that's hurt San Francisco and Boston, is that people just can't afford to live there. So I think that that's something that we have to look at. We need to make sure that the talent that we train and the resources